Welcome to Zen and the Art of Licensing. My name is Erik Limpitlaw. I'm the Digital Collections Licensing Librarian at Stanford, and my colleague Maridath.
Hi, I'm so glad you're here. Maridath Wilson. I'm the head of Resource Acquisition and Management for the Boston College Libraries.
You might be wondering why there's a volcano up here when we're talking about relationships and Zen. I think it's a little bit of maybe my dark humor. And I think when we start thinking about licensing, we often stay away from it or try to steer clear from it. There's a lot of unknown. There might be some embedded fear. It's not dangerous. That's kind of why we're here. We want to make sure that you understand that you have colleagues and resources and pathways for you to get through this, what seemingly might be a dangerous time. Volcanoes are dangerous, licensing is not. So make sure we get through that. We are not going to be negotiating licenses. We're not going to go through contracts and redline. If that's of interest, we can
consult with you.
Consult. But it would be a great opportunity to do a workshop, starting to get some measured interest around the practices, the practicality of it. We also realize that each institution, you all have your own policies, you all have your own constraints internally, and we're offering our approaches and hopefully share with you some incremental changes you can then take home and make on your own, no matter how small they might be, word choice particularly, and also be an advocate for your e-resources when you're reviewing those licenses.
Yeah, and I also just want to add that we're sharing our perspective as librarians. We recognize that one of the, I think, candidly beautiful things about this conference is there's also quite a few publishers and vendors represented in the room. We are also from larger institutions, so kind of like what Erik said, some of our practices may not directly map onto yours. But if you leave with nothing else, I hope you leave with two things. One, that a contract basically documents a long conversation with someone, and that's all you're doing. And also that there are, as Erik said, some incremental changes that you can make locally, no matter how small your institution is. So with that, I want to just do a quick poll. By a show of hands, how many of you are coming from a library? Okay, nice. How many of you are at a publisher? How many of you are at an aggregator or like a library technology company? Oh, okay, hi, glad to have you. So we will keep that in mind as we go through our prepared slides.
Can everyone hear us in the back? We've been told for recording purposes. Great.
Awesome. Oh, one other thing I should also mention, because this is a licensing talk, this is not intended to be legal advice, and this is also, we are not speaking on behalf of our institutions. We are speaking as individuals who are interested in this space.
We also have about 10 slides, so we're going to try to move through these so we have about a good 10 minutes of questions potentially, and if not, then we can continue the discussion up here.
Absolutely. So I'm going to just take us through our agenda at a super high level. So we want to first begin, which we'll do in a moment, by acknowledging the land that we're all on. We're going to tell you a little bit about mine and Erik's backstory, so how we got first curious about licensing. That's the key ingredient. If you're here, you already have it, right? You're already curious about licensing. We'll talk to you a little bit about why license agreements are important. Yes, there's things like risk that need to be managed, there's compliance, but there's also the ways in which researchers are conducting their research now, right? Things like text and data mining, generative AI, ability to link on course reserves, scholarly sharing, you name it. And those need to be and should be written into your contracts. We're also going to sort of hopefully disabuse you of some licensing misconceptions. That'll be fun. And then we're going to talk about what we see as a really clear divide in the labor of licensing. So often in libraries, we talk about licensing and negotiation in the same breath, and we often like to think they're the same thing. We see negotiation of pricing and term link as the negotiation. We see licensing as, I want to be very clear, a close review of the attendant contract. including red line, suggestion of changes, things of that nature. So a lot of times folks say, well, we're doing licensing at my institution because we're buying digital products. So we want to be clear that this is about actually reviewing and negotiating the contract. And then also sort of like the what's next, what keeps us up at night part, and then a little dialogue with you. For our land acknowledgement, so ultimately this entire presentation is our reflection on the power of language, right? So language is ultimately, right, what's in our contracts. And language evolves, right? Culture evolves. And so as we were thinking about preparing for this presentation, we were really struck by thinking about the history of Charleston, both in terms of the indigenous tribes that called this land home and still do, and then also the long history of Charleston and the Africans that largely built this beautiful city that we enjoy today. And so in thinking through those things, we want to be clear that we refer to we do not use the term master agreement, we use the term governing agreement. And so just kind of a note on how licensing language is also evolving.
Great, that was perfect, thank you. So where do we learn licensing? As I was preparing for this slide, so this is an interesting question, and because just by asking it, we've sort of answered it. The idea is to ask more questions. And there's no wrong question. There's no real right answer either here. And I think that's the idea of being more comfortable with language, becoming more familiar, and engaging with people who might be experts in it, and asking us to be experts in reviewing and understanding these terms, and helping them bring us up to speed. By a show of hands, I venture that this is not a room full of attorneys. So this is great. We're all in the same boat, and I think we're all doing similar work. And what I'm finding through my networks and trying to expand the knowledge base here is that we're all kind of doing the same thing. For the most part, we're all talking to the same vendors, and I still have yet to see one license look similar to another. There's things found in different areas, there's patchwork done depending on need. It is a very tall order for a librarian to start taking on this work, in addition to everything that we are already tasked with in terms of growing and meeting all of those new emerging technologies as well. My background, I came into this sort of a different angle. I think this is why we sort of pair up really well. I have a law degree. I practiced for a little while, and by the fact that I'm not in front of a room full of attorneys means that I did something right. I did not enjoy working with attorneys day in and day out. But what I can tell you is that reviewing Supreme Court cases is completely different than reading journal licenses. And so in that respect, I've come through book publishing through Westlaw. I used to meet and travel and meet with law professors across the country, talk about their pedagogy, talk about their adoption rate, and move them into an electronic environment. What that did is it allowed me to meet and also work for vendors like Springer, but also work with librarians and figure out what are those use cases that need to be represented. These agreements are not being litigated to the extent we think they might be. They're debated. I don't think in any particular case I've ever really debated the law specifically. I'm just looking for representation in these agreements for what we are doing at our institution. And for that, we can use regular layman language. These agreements don't need to be complex. What I will just sort of end on and pass it off to Maridath is that there is always sort of this balance of self-evaluation and looking and auditing our own agreements and figuring out if we're meeting the risk assessment that a university is comfortable with, identifying what risk the library is taking on, and by extension, how much control are we giving their end users? It's really important more than ever now that this technology is emerging, that our researchers are really driving what's being published, what's being written, how research is being done. But I think we're at a place where we can stop and take a step back and say, are we doing enough? Can I make this process better? Do I have all the information and skills necessary to spot what is potentially harmful?
Yeah, so Erik kind of took you through his origin story. So I'll take you through mine, which is kind of an opposite, but I would agree, complementary route. So I went to library school. I did not go to law school. And then I spent some time working at a large journals aggregator in a sales role. And so one of the things that I did in that role was I was the go-between between the customer, right, the librarian, and the legal department. And that's when I first sort of got introduced to what we think of as the common hiccups in licenses, indemnity, right? What's the difference between indemnity and hold harmless, right? That's a fun legal debate. What governing law does this institution need? These sorts of things. And then so that's when I first sort of became curious, which, remember, that's the first ingredient, is curiosity. Then a few years ago, I was head of scholarly resources for Boston University libraries, and I built the licensing program from scratch. So how did I do that? Well, it's so interesting. You might remember at the beginning I said sometimes we think licensing is just buying things. Well, I think that's kind of low-key what I thought that role was going to be, and then I learned it was contract review, right? So I had to learn even more about it through the network that Erik and I are part of, Neural, through doing my own reading, my own sort of professional development. And then it became clear to me that I was going to need to make some key relationships on campus to manage those contracts and then also fill in some knowledge gaps that I had. So I actually did a thing which is weirdly controversial in a lot of libraries, and I partnered really hard with our procurement department. So the way that I did that was we wrote together like a governing list of terms. Some I wrote, some they wrote. I wrote the ones that relate to library work, right? Like ability to ILL. They wrote the ones around university risk tolerance. So we had a playbook and a toolkit that we were both operating out of. And I treated it like we do library liaison work, right? So they had a liaison model where different contract specialists in procurement were paired up with different departments on campus, because we can imagine that the person that runs the contract for, the folks that mow the lawn, that's probably a different, procurement role than the folks that are working with library technologies and content, or even IT technologies. So we spent a long time sort of educating each other on our worlds and what we both needed in a contract. And I am very proud to say that by the time I left Boston University, I'm now at Boston College, they were reading The Scholarly Kitchen. They were really interested in our space, and it made them better negotiators. And it also made them understand the things that the library was going to need. So it was a really wonderful partnership, and that's where I also got really exposed to this thing that Erik just spoke about, which is that a contract can and should be written in plain language, and it's actually okay for you to ask your sales rep what something means, right? That was revolutionary for me. I thought I had to understand it, and you actually don't. Yeah.
I think that's great. I want to just reinforce the fact that hopefully you can see somebody on this screen that you can reach out to ask more about whether or not a particular license is meeting the university standards or the institution standards. What I think the challenge here is for publishers is when a librarian is asking questions, the vendor may not know the answer right away, and it's sort of a flip of how the librarian feels, is because we're getting these agreements. I know at Stanford we were able to do our own review, but it's all been on the job. And while we might have access to Office of General Counsel, we've gotten terms that we should be looking for and variations on them that we can make autonomously. But there are those terms that we just also should just defer to
Right.
attorneys, especially the ones that are in all caps. I still don't know why they're all in all caps. I try to like reverse
Or international agreements, right? Like I used
Yeah.
to pass all of those to general counsel just because they're written in totally different ways, right? That I was not super familiar with.
So we're looking at access, we're looking at use restrictions, we're looking at responsibility the library may have, termination clauses. You might have seen a lot of destruction of property upon termination, or I'm seeing it now at the end user that we need to sign off that the researcher's personal device will be clear of all.
That one really bothers me, by the way.
You don't have to agree to that. You can say that this is beyond the scope of what the library can do. It's out of our control. There are lots of justifications that we can all sort of agree and borrow, and we're all making these arguments independently if we catch them. And that's another thing that I also want to bring in, moving into the next slide, is why are these licenses important? I hope this is a review for you. If not, then we need to spend some time after school on why this is important. This is basically, as I'm starting to learn more about OA and transformative agreements, emerging technologies and use cases around text and data mining, and now artificial intelligence, these agreements are long in length for a reason. They represent the university's interests, the library's interest, the publisher's interest. They are often end user terms, restrictions on what the faculty and staff can do, what the researchers can do, where they can store it, can they use it for peer review. We're seeing that a lot more in data acquisitions and data sets, things that are not more easily interlibrary loaned. So those reservations of being able to use and store for potential future use is more sometimes specific to that institution and maybe the research that you're doing there. It's also outlining authors' rights. It is a trust and estates strategy for long-term preservation when a potential vendor, may expire, right? It's also a divorce clause for when you separate, when you go your own ways, who has custody of the content and how can you access it? Do you have rights on the weekends only and holidays, or is it just something that you can locally load? And if that's something you're able to do and something you want to do, then it's up to us in this room to request that. It's likely available. It's likely in other institutional agreements similar to yours, but they're not being offered to you because it's coming from a group of people that are not in your shoes.
Yeah.
So the Zen part, and sort of pulling back, and relationship part about this is making sure that we're communicating what those resources and those requirements are at the user level and making sure that they're represented in these agreements. I've often been in meetings where I've been told that we can do something, and then I ask them to point to it in the agreement, and it's just not there. And so what do you do? And they say it's okay, and it's not okay. You all have to agree to stuff. And it is important to have it in writing, and it's important to spend time on it. So
yeah, I just want to pick up quickly on two really salient points per usual that Erik made. So it does take a long time, right? We're going to talk a little later about the labor of licensing. This is labor. We do have some tools and tricks for how to make it go, a little more efficiently, a little faster at your institution, but we really feel that it's labor worth doing for all of the reasons and use cases that Erik just laid out. The other reason why it can be really powerful when deployed strategically to work with your Office of Procurement, if you're managing that relationship well, is the procurement office can also be your ally in your negotiations. They can be the heavy if you need one, because if you are a licensing librarian, an acquisitions librarian, an e-resources librarian, whatever flavor of your title you might have at your institution, one of your primary jobs is to manage the relationship with your sales rep. And the way that you can keep that relationship good is to have backup from your institution. The other thing is too, so Sarah Forzetting, who works with Erik at Stanford, where she's the head of acquisitions, I think I got her title right. She and I have done a lot of negotiation work, not so much licensing work, but deal-making work with NEURL, the Northeast Research Libraries Consortium, which is incidentally how I came to know Erik. And one of the things that she and I were talking about a couple years ago is exactly what Erik said, right? Which is it's all well and good to send an email or receive an email from a publisher who says, yeah, no, you can totally text and data mine. That's fine. Like we actually have to just start writing those things into the contracts for both parties' protection. Because part of this, again, is relationship management. And I think the more that we can understand, again, that this is not a scary thing, and this is simply about making mutual commitments to each other. Those of you that have heard me speak at Charleston know I always love to remind folks that our mutual survival is tied up in each other. And so part of how we do that is we write things down.
Please write stuff down. It's really only going to help all of us as we field these responses. Well, Erik, I've never gotten this question before from anybody before. And I struggle with that because I want to say, why? How did that happen? And I think that the impetus for this conversation is to make sure that we step back and we read everything. You don't have to understand the entire agreement. Like you said, is a lot of stuff in there. But picking out what's relevant for your library and what's relevant for your users, and making space for growth, and have it not be so publisher-centric. Sorry, we're also working off of someone else's work all the time. You can be ethical and create caveats for librarians and the researchers in a document coming from a publisher. It's not really their place or responsibility to advocate for the library or to advocate for the researcher. We are all doing this in our roles in other areas. I don't think that these skills and the curiosity behind them are anything new. We're just asking you to just like lean in a little bit more, where when we didn't know how to deal with text and data mining and we had to talk to our technical specialists. And I'm constantly learning about how AI is working and how whether or not our end users at Stanford are using it in the way that the publishers want to restrict.
Nobody knows the answer to that question yet, but anyway.
Licensing misconceptions. Maridath, do you want to start us off on this?
Yeah, so they do exist, right? Quite a few of them exist. You've heard a few of them from us already. You don't have to have a background in law to do this. You shouldn't necessarily exclude using your network to learn more about it, whether that's the consortium that you're part of, friends and neighbors and colleagues, whether that is the procurement office. And it is not just buying things. If you are buying something and you are signing the standard terms, you are not actually doing it. Was that good enough?
Yeah, that's great. I would say, just because I think we want to re-echo this, I often come across very complex language around, I don't know, storage or scholarly sharing, or someone's trying to reinvent the wheel, and there might be somebody new at the publisher who feels like this needs to be adjusted. It's okay to ask why you're rewriting this. It's okay to ask for an example of a use case. Where does this apply? I'm working on an engineering license. I don't really know a whole lot about engineering, but I know that it's not going to be used for AI. And by talking to our bibliographers and the specialists, I can just sort of get around that right now and not hold up the license, and maybe talk about it when we're all ready to assign a definition to it, or to talk about it from a perspective where both sides are ready. There is a level of ethics here that I want to reinforce. Attorneys do have ethics. It is more around the balance of negotiating power and making sure that there's an even knowledge base. And I feel like when you're often working as an attorney and you're drumming up business and people are hurt and there's damages, and it's often perceived as an imbalance, and sometimes attorneys only want to talk to other attorneys. This is not the case here. I've been told from large publishers that they'll only talk to Office of General Counsel, and when I pushed and pushed and pushed, because it's not a requirement, we just want to understand what's in there, I finally was able to get to the point where this particular person found it unethical to talk to a librarian. I was like, well, we've been negotiating licenses for 20 years. Right. What's happening? And I think that really spoke to the idea of, oh, we are asking you to do a lot. And actually, we're asking you to do more. Mm-hmm. This brings me to the point where the difference between negotiating and licensing at Stanford, when I came in, there was a lot of people working on the licenses, and I realized that the business terms, the terms of, well, what do we want to license? How much do we want it? And how much funds do we have in these particular areas can be decided by the selectors, liaisons. We call them bibliographers at Stanford. And then it can be passed off to someone maybe in my position who has the time and the expertise to make sure there's continuity across agreements, that can work with it's often not the salesperson that we'll negotiate with. And that is a big deal because as a salesperson myself, I was never really familiar with the license terms until my client had questions and I had to go learn. And I've been doing this a long time, and so you just sort of develop a vocabulary and a bank of terms and sort of be able to anticipate these problems. I would like us as a group to ask the vendors to start anticipating these questions and getting us these agreements earlier, and negotiating these terms and reviewing them at the same time that our bibliographers are selecting content. So when November comes, we're done. I don't have to get a license last minute because they've decided it's been 5 years. It's okay to say no to that as well.
Oh yeah, I think
sorry,
people
publishers.
Forget that. You can always say no.
If you are looking for a new agreement, please send it early.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. It's not going to jeopardize the sale. I think that's sort of the misconception, and the idea of why now. I think that these licenses are getting more complex. We're adding more responsibilities, as I mentioned earlier. I think we've gotten away a lot longer than maybe we should have without looking at these in such detail. And we need to also be educating our end users on what they can and cannot do. So, encouraging you to look at your library website terms of use, make sure they're up to date. Make sure that wherever you can in your faculty senate meetings that you bring this up. It's really important. It's not just around the code of conduct, right, around students misusing for achievement and grade. It's using licensed copyrighted material for other purposes. That puts everybody at risk.
Yeah, and I'll also just say quickly, in the interest of time, one of the things that we do at Boston College is we have split this out. There are so many librarians, there's probably some in this room, who are doing both the business terms negotiation, price term, term length, and they are reviewing the license. We actually have two separate roles that do this at BC. It's not dissimilar to what Erik described at Stanford. And I'm actually hiring a licensing librarian right now to do this work. So come and see me afterwards if you're at all curious about the role. I'm really excited. They're going to get to build a program in the way that I did that at my previous institution. So we're looking for somebody to redline and negotiate contracts with the vendors, forge a new relationship with procurement and general counsel, and then also do like a little bit of like internal public services. So when liaisons or instruction librarians or friends over in reserves have questions, or our data librarian, I field those once a week right now, so I need to hire this role, pop up and say, hey, can this end user text and data mine I don't know, like a large historical newspapers database, right? This person will, then go and pull the license and, give sort of their opinion on the use case. So if any of that is at all interesting to you, I would love to meet you, and I would love to meet the people that you know also.
In that respect, there are skills around reviewing a license, best practices that we can go over in another session, or if you have something pressing, we can look at it together. There's a bit of a skill involved with using the resources that we have in either Word or Acrobat and redlining. It's something you just get better at over time. There's no good way of doing it. It's just the idea of being concise and brief. We sort of covered this in the interest of time, just the idea of you don't have to do this by yourself. There are resources out there, listservs, consortia. People are talking about this. If you have particular issues with particular clauses or you're seeing them more frequent, please reach out to the greater community. Something that has been really wonderful for me to have been accepted coming from this profession at a different angle. I've learned so much about what to look for that I can really only attribute the work I'm doing now to people that have shared their experiences. We know that everybody has the same resources. This is our final slide. I want to make sure we have some time. Yeah. Here's a list of things that we can do. What's worked most recently is where I have aging governing agreements.
I have so many. I have a whole filing cabinet.
I don't know why this year and next year, they're all about to expire. My process is when I get a new agreement is I look at them both. There's a great, if you have Adobe Acrobat, you can, there's a function at the very bottom, you have to select more and more and more, but you can compare two documents and also remove any of the graphics in that comparison. So it puts two documents up next to each other, and it shows you what is different from the other. It's very detailed, but it gives you an impression overall how much might be changed, and it also gives you a roadmap of how to start identifying what might be important if there are certain changes in library responsibilities or access or restrictions. Those are the things that you might want to look at. Not everything is in the right place, so please ask your vendor, sales rep, can you please provide a summary of what's changed?
Saves everybody time.
Pairing up and sharing the burden of asking a librarian to do this terrible task. I do it all the time, and I think that's the worst thing, is having to compare those terms, because not everything is brought over that you worked so hard for 5 years ago. You have to re-ask, you have to re-justify. It's been working. So in some instances, I've gotten the actual document redlined. In some instances, I've gotten summary over email, and it just confirms something that I might be doing on my own, but it also sets the publishers and vendors on alert that we are looking at this and we're asking you to help share the burden. It is a tremendous relief to get something from the publisher and say, you don't have to worry about, there's nothing here about your uses, or hey, there's something in here about artificial intelligence. Nobody is telling me that that's in there right now, and I encourage you all to just read. If not for something specific, you'll discover other things that you might be unaware of.
And the schedule, right? Yeah. I set a 5-year schedule of review when I was at Boston University. So every license, I did like 30 or 40 of them a year. And if a vendor, full review, right? I don't mean an amendment or a writer. If a vendor popped up and said, you need to do a new license this year, I'd say, oh no, boo, you're on my schedule 2 years later, I've got to do X, Y, and Z this year. So you can always writer on. I never had anybody say that was a problem. And I think folks forget that.
And you can add something as an amendment mid-year, something that's so pressing that needs to be in a contract.
Like scholarly sharing.
If you're rubbing up against an invoice date, sign the thing, and then just do it in 2 months if it's that important. I hate to see people stressed at the end of the year for things that we can foresee and anticipate. It's an idea about being more conscious about that. Here's a list of things that we have identified as sort of changes, things that we were fielding, new job roles, new research methods, all kinds of new agreements, all having to represent different types of voices. And I hope that there are some questions.
Yeah.
There's a mic up here at the foot of the ramp. I encourage you to stand up. If you'd like me to run out with a microphone, I can do that too.
I might like to see you do that. That might be fun.
Fair. I did step into that. By a show of hands, has this been relevant? Are people reviewing licenses in this room? Yeah. Have we seen any new language like artificial intelligence creep in? A few?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting.
Were those publisher hands? No.
No. And it's so interesting because it really, feels like, I want to be careful about how I say this, that sort of is not dissimilar of a use case to text and data mining, which is something that publishers were really freaked out about a few years ago. But the library as a community, worked really hard to sort of explain that very not scary use case to publishers and then write it into the contract. So just wondering if that's something we should be thinking about now. Other questions?
Other questions? Yes, please, thanks.
I had a question, Chris Blackman from Williams College. I had a question on how you have been dealing with transformative agreements being written into your licenses, and what type of communication have you been doing, say, with faculty, Dean of Faculty's office, in order to get those licenses finalized?
I can do the communication piece if you like.
That'd be great.
So let me see. So we are still trying to get our arms around what our overall OA strategy is going to be at Boston College. I work in a different context maybe than some of you all. We don't have a med school. So we're still trying to figure it out. We have historically only done like subscribe to open kind of models so far. So we haven't really had to do a lot of communication, but I'm also really lucky because I'm at kind of a large institution. So we have a ScholComm department that handles a lot of the review of author side limitations and agreements, and then also working on that communication, like with faculty senate and things like that. So, and then there was another piece, Eric, to that question.
What was it?
Negotiating TA contracts.
Oh.
Getting the information into, because the transformative agreement is written into, at least in the one license that I have signed so far, is that's written into our license, and I'm signing on behalf of the college for faculty publishing rights.
Yeah.
It's a good question. If I had an agreement, I would ask the publisher to distill what's new or what the responsibilities are, summarize that. I feel like during the negotiation, the things that we've been talking about, we're still fact gathering ourselves and figuring out if it's a good model at Stanford. But identifying who can help you with that communication if you don't have somebody there. The idea of pushing this transformation has to come also a little bit more from the people that have the resources that are pushing for this.
Right.
I know it's not a great answer, but it all feels bespoke at this point. There isn't a great way to blast out news to even our authors or even our end users in that respect. So it's a reasonable way of using our resources. We're not building things to do this, and then we're looking for responsibility and tools from the publisher on that side.
If we don't get to your question, also, we're happy to talk to you afterwards. Okay.